The Violin's Echo by Tony Angelo. I was born in a place on no map, a location called only by a wicked word that the villagers of the South Caucasus uttered between their teeth when they spoke of the barren ridge above the curve of the river. The ridge, all pine and broken rocks, watched over an orphanage that seemed to rise from the sorrow itself of the land. I was 5 when I heard the wind whining through broken shutters for the first time, and 12 when a violin, a cracked, old thing left in a corner, was my only consolation. My name is Mir. It is a soft, almost inaudible sound, like a sigh caught between two breaths. In the orphanage's cramped dormitory, the children would often poke fun at it, turning my name into a joke that stung like the winter's bite. Yet the name was the only thing that felt truly mine. Everything else, my bed, my blanket, the gray walls, belonged to the institution, not to me. The first note. It was on the autumn harvest festival night that caretaker Mrs. Nara handed me the violin. Wood cracked, the strings iron hard with rust, yet the bow sang when run across the instrument. I drew out the first note, and it reverberated across the empty hall, striking a chord that seemed to stir the very foundations of stone beneath my own feet. The other children ran up, eyes agog with envy and admiration. The world tilted on its axis, and I, an orphan boy, felt a twinge of something that I could not define, hope, or possession. The violin sang on, and for the first time in my life I believed I could say something that people could not silence. But hope is a frail thing in a country of abandonment. Before the harvest of jealousy, in a matter of weeks, the resentment of the other children fermented into something darker. The orphanage, where the wail of every child was silenced by the next, could not contain the whispers which swelled each night. The older boys, the ones who had learned how to survive by taking what they could and never giving anything in return, began whispering that the violin was not safe, a sort of a kind that could cut through the veil of our mutual despair and leave us naked. I woke one night to the shattering of a broken glass. The hallway was pitch dark, only lit by a weak bulb which throbbed like a faint heart. Shadows crept, their eyes hidden in the darkness, and I felt the burden of their gaze upon me as if they could sense the tremble in my heartbeat. "You think a broken violin makes you a king?" a voice sneered, harsh and deep. It was Jella, the oldest of the boys, his eyes glinting with a wild light. "You've played that cursed instrument long enough. It's time we take it back." I tried to speak, to defend the instrument that was my sole comfort, but the sounds did not carry in the dry air. The boys held the violin, their fingers wrapped around the wood like a snake. Mikhail, whose scar began at his temple and finished at his jaw, pressed the strings between his uncovered fingers, snapping them like twigs. The violin released its last note, a screech that shot through the hall, lingering in my brain like an echo. I was expelled that night. The night of exile. The orphanage's director, a gaunt man named Mr. Gerben, called me to his office. His eyes, sunken and hollow, flickered with a mixture of guilt and resignation. "You're too different, Mir," he said, voice trembling as if he feared the walls might overhear. "You bring attention, and attention brings scrutiny. The agency will not look kindly upon an orphanage that nurtures a prodigy while the rest of us rot." He handed me a creased piece of paper, a notice of discharge. It read, bluntly in official language, that I was to leave immediately, without provisions, without guardian, and without explanation. The other children stared at me, their faces a patchwork of fear and release. Envy had turned to group cruelty, and at that moment I knew hope, when outnumbered, can be a strong weapon. I left via the front door, the icy cold air biting into my skin, the weight of the notice heavy in my pocket. I was alone, no longer an orphan tied to a house of refuge, and the violin, my one instrument, leaped in ruin from the hallway floor behind me. It was that I came into a nightmare, a cycle that would follow me for the rest of my days. The nightmare. I was back in the orphanage, but it had been transformed. The walls no longer had that gray color, they were a rich, purple bruise color, pulsing like veins under the skin. The children still lingered, but their faces had been transformed into transparent things, their eyes black holes that consumed light. They walked slowly, keeping time with each other, every movement mirroring the tick of an endless clock. In the middle of the hall was a grand piano, its top up, with a black and cavernous interior. My own violin, once played by me, stood on top of the piano, unbroken and unstained, its wood gleaming like burnished obsidian. A voice, Mrs. Nara's, but distorted, sang a lullaby that I couldn't understand. The words were a cry for change, for hope, for some kind of response to the terror that we endured. Each note that pushed out of the piano was a promise of salvation, a promise that couldn't be fulfilled. I reached for the violin, trembling, but when my fingers touched the strings, the floor gave way. I fell into nothing, into a chasm that stretched to nowhere. In the darkness, I heard weeping children, each one a little different note, each one singing the same verse, the change here that will never occur. The hope that will never be. The response that will never come. I awoke in my own little dormitory, the night quiet, the sound of nothing but the distant howl of the wind whipping against the pine trees outside. My shirt was drenched with sweat, and the crumpled discharge notice lay on the floor, its ink smudged by my tears. The pursuit. I could not stay. The orphanage, so responsive to my violin's song, now felt like a sepulchre. I escaped through a side window, the cold hitting my face like a slap. The ridge stretched out before me, its shape a dark line against the moon. I knew the path into the woods, my feet knew the stones, the roots, the hidden streams that sliced through the underbrush like veins. The fog was thick on the evening. The wind was whispering to me as I walked, words that I could not make out. They were coming, it seemed, from the trees themselves, as though the woods remembered the brutality of the orphanage. I had no place to turn. I only knew that I could not return to the location where I lost my instrument, my hope, my place among the children. I walked until my legs ached, until my breathing became wheezy. As the first light of morning tinctured the sky in bruised gold, I emerged on a curving road that led to a small village in a valley. The houses were stone with wooden shutters that groaned with the wind. The villagers eyed me suspiciously and with curiosity, their faces lined with years of hardship. I approached a plain tavern, its sign groaning softly, proclaiming "the stubborn goat." The air inside was thick with the scent of smoked lamb and old beer. Behind the bar was a bartender, a silver-haired woman with tightly braided silver locks. She looked up at me. "Food," I croaked, dry throat. "Water." She nodded, refilled my glass with clear water and a chunk of stale bread. I ate, watching the other patrons, men and women with gaunt faces, eyes that had seen too many things. Something in the room nagged at me, a pull of distrust, as if the village had a secret or two larger than the river that divided it. I said, even though I could sense the weight of my name on my lips. "My name is Mir," I told her, an afterthought at best. She raised an eyebrow. "We don't have many children here," she informed me, her tone gritty. "Not ones with names like that, anyway." I tried to explain, but the words stuck. I asked instead about the neighborhood, about the ridge, about the orphanage. She hesitated, then gave a measured response. "There's something up there," she said, nodding toward the window. "An old house that used to be an orphanage. They closed it down years ago after a tragedy. Nobody goes near it anymore. They say the children never left." Her words sent a cold shiver running down my spine. Recollection of the broken windows of the orphanage, the smell of wet stone, and the recurring nightmare that swirled within my mind all rushed back to me. I could feel the shroud of my past closing in, as if something intangible was compelling me to view it. The return. Silence in the village was a kind of prison. I could stay, be another forgotten specter, or I could return to the ridge and confront the darkness which had stolen my violin. The decision was forced upon me by the nightmare of that night, by the haunting threat of a change that would never happen unless I did something about it. I spent the night sleeping on the floor of the tavern attic, the boards groaning beneath my restless movements. By the faint light of candles, I pulled out the wrinkled notice of dismissal from my pocket and read it through again. The words became indistinct, then distinct, reforming to convey a different message: leave and forget, or stay and learn what was concealed. I woke at dawn, the initial light seeping through the crevices between the wood. I filled a small bag with what I had: bread, water, the defective discharge notice, which had been torn apart, and a little wooden flute my mother had given me before sending me to the orphanage. I never knew her, but the flute was a reminder that I had ever lived in a world outside of stone walls. I slipped out the back door, the old woman's eyes tracking me with a mixture of pity and reproach. The route back up to the ridge was treacherous, the forest a maze of thorns and hidden roots. Ascending the narrow path which twisted up to the abandoned orphanage, I could hear the wind moan through the leaves, as though it bore the moans of the past. The ridge loomed ahead of me, its silhouette the form of a skeletal finger pointing heavenward. It was in a state of ruin when I originally discovered it, a building shell of what had been the dwelling of so many souls lost. The doors were flung open, hanging in the wind, the interior dark. I stepped inside, the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet reminding me with each creak of the myriad of footfalls that had walked upon its halls. I entered the hall where the violin had been broken. The room was empty, but the atmosphere was charged with a thrumming hum, a vibration that stood the hairs on the back of my neck on end. I felt a presence, as though the building itself existed, letting out a sigh that carried with it decades of sorrow. I sifted through the wreckage, prying up twisted furniture and overturned crates, until I uncovered a tiny, hidden space behind a rotting wooden bench. In it was a wooden box, its lid adorned with intricate patterns, a pattern the same as the patterns of the ancient Caucasian patterns. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside, oiled in oilcloth, lay a violin that I had never laid eyes on. Its wood was the color of darkness, almost black, but with an otherworldly glow that seemed to draw light in. The strings were unbroken, quietly humming as if asking to be played. On the side of the box, there was a word, carved out in an ancient font: to the child who sings the night, may your voice break the silence. A wave of emotion surged over me: fear, hope, the shiver of the primal need that had led me to the orphanage in the first place. I took up the violin, its weight, its balance. It was perfect, as if it had waited for a hand to grasp it. The moment I placed my hands on the strings, the building shook. The walls groaned deeply, gutturally, as if the orphanage itself was exhaling a breath that it had held for years. The air turned cold, and a figure emerged out of the darkness, a child, no older than 10, with eyes that shone like the darkness of the night. "Long time," the child said, voice echoing off between shattered walls. "You left us, but we never left you." I watched, my heart pounding. The boy's face was familiar to me, not because I knew him, but because his sorrow was mine as well. He was the face of all the children whose tears were stifled by the orphanage's stone. He held out a trembling hand, and I felt the shock of cold fire running through my veins. "The change here that never will occur," he said to me, "the hope that never will arise, the reply that never will be given, are all of the same piece. You must perform it, and the world will hear." My mind reeled. The nightmare's refrain reverberated in my head, a prayer of failure and loss. But here, in this destroyed place, a lost violin offered the chance to recompose that refrain. I lifted the bow, set it across the strings, and drew it across. The sound of the first note was low and plaintive, resonating through the desolate hall. It was no mere melody, it was a prayer, a scream, a lament all mixed into one. As the din intensified, the walls pulsed, the dust on the air whirling in a hurricane. I felt the presence of all the children who ever lived here, each a dissonance in this harmony of hopelessness. Their faces came before me, thin, skeletal ones, eyes wide with fear, mouths stretched in unspoken screams. They coalesced out of the shadows, ghosts made of memory, surrounding me in a circle of shaking light. The violin wailed more shrilly, the notes entwining, climbing to a deafening crescendo. The building shook, a rift splitting the ceiling, light spilling through the fractured cleft. The stone floor cracked open, and out of the chasm erupted a deluge of water, clear, cold, spilling out like the tears of 1,000 bereaved souls. I was afraid, but the music protected me, the melody formed a shield about my heart. I could feel the pain of the children seeping out, surging over the corruption that had held them captive. The echo of the nightmare never was shattered under the weight of the music. As the final note had disappeared, the water receded, the fissure closed, and the hall fell silent. The ghost children melted away, their faces untensing into smiles of relief. The black violin in my fingers glowed with a soft light, its wood being warm and amber-tinted. I dropped to my knees, exhausted, the music echoing in my head. The child who had spoken to me, a reflection of the orphanage's collective sorrow, vanished, leaving behind only a trace in my heart. Aftermath. I left the ruins at dawn, the sun rising over the ridge and lighting the world in golden tones. I had the violin with me, and its weight was no longer burden but promise. The path back to the village was dangerous, but with each step, I felt less weighed down, as if the ghosts that had chased me had finally been released. When I returned to the tavern, the bartender with silver hair regarded me with surprise and reverence. "You're back," she murmured. I set the violin on the table, its strings vibrating softly in the air. "It sings," I breathed, "it sings for those who have no voice." The villagers arrived, drawn by the noise. I drew the bow back, and the violin sang again, not a dirge, but a rebellion hymn. The notes went up, inscribing their path along the rafters, touching every heart. I understood in that moment that what I had thought would never shift was not an instance but a series of small, persistent chords that could change the world's rhythm. The horror of the night had shown me something that could never beat silence, unresponsive life. Through defiance of the darkness, through not letting the silence smother the cries of the abandoned, I had given an answer, not just to me, but to all the children whose hope was stolen. Years went by, the Ridge Orphanage lies in ruins, the stones covered in vines, yet the myth of the violin that played all through the night was spread far and wide across the land. Children in the nearby villages begin to learn the violin, the flute, the piano, all instruments that can speak what cannot be uttered. The Ridge, once a place of loss, is now a pilgrimage destination for those seeking to hear the sound of a boy's violin. I never receive a proper apology from the caretakers, nor a letter from the agency that expelled me. The answer never arrives in the form of a letter or a deed. But in the music which now fills the air, in the smile of children who hear their own songs, I find the answer I was seeking. I am still Mir, the boy who once stood in a broken hall, violin in his hand, cracked and broken, surrounded by jealousy and rejection. I am now the man who walks along the ridge, violin in hand, turning tragedy into a song of hope. The nightmare of the night still visits me at times, but it no longer leaves me breathless. Rather, it strikes me that the darkness that once resonated within those walls of stone may be shattered, note by note.